أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ياسين والقرآن الحكيم إنك لمن المرسلين على صراط مستقيم. تنزيل العزيز الرحيم لتنذر قوما ما أنذر آباؤهم فهم غافلون. لقد حق القول على أكثرهم فهم لا يؤمنون. إنا جعلنا في أعناقهم أغلالا فهي إلى الأذقان فهم مقمحون. وجعلنا من بين أيديهم سدا ومن خلفهم سدا فأغشيناهم فهم لا يبصرون. وسواء عليهم أنذرتهم أم لم تنذرهم لا يؤمنون. إنما تنذر من اتبع الذكر وخشي الرحمن بالغيب فبشره بمغفرة وأجر كريم. إنا نحن نحيي الموتى ونكتب ما قدموا وآثارهم وكل شيء أحصيناه في إمام مبين. واضرب لهم مثلا أصحاب القرية إذ جاءها المرسلون إذ أرسلنا إليهم اثنين فكذبوهما فعززنا بثالث فقالوا إنا إليكم مرسلون. قالوا ما أنتم إلا بشر مثلنا وما أنزل الرحمن من شيء إن أنتم إلا تكذبون. قالوا ربنا يعلم إنا إليكم لمرسلون وما علينا إلا البلاغ المبين. قالوا إنا تطيرنا بكم لئن لم تنتهوا لنرجمنكم وليمسنكم منا عذاب أليم. قالوا طائركم معكم أئن ذكرتم بل أنتم قوم مسرفون. وجاء من أقصى المدينة رجل يسعى قال يا قوم اتبعوا المرسلين اتبعوا من لا يسألكم أجرا وهم مهتدون. وما لي لا أعبد الذي فطرني وإليه ترجعون. أتخذ من دونه آلهة إن يردني الرحمن بضر لا تغني عني شفاعتهم شيئا ولا ينقذون. إني إذا لفي ضلال مبين. إني آمنت بربكم فاسمعون. قيل ادخل الجنة قال يا ليت قومي يعلمون بما غفر لي ربي وجعلني من المكرمين. وما أنزلنا على قومه من بعده من جند من السماء وما كنا منزلين. إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم خامدون. يا حسرة على العباد ما يأتيهم من رسول إلا كانوا به يستهزئون. ألم يروا كم أهلكنا قبلهم من القرون أنهم إليهم لا يرجعون. وإن كل لما جميع لدينا محضرون. وآية لهم الأرض الميتة أحييناها وأخرجنا منها حبا فمنه يأكلون. وجعلنا فيها جنات من نخيل وعناب وفجرنا فيها من العيون ليأكلوا من ثمره وما عملته أيديهم أفلا يشكرون. سبحان الذي خلق الأزواج كلها مما تنبت الأرض ومن أنفسهم مما لا يعلمون. وآية لهم الليل نسلخ منه النهار فإذا هم مظلمون. والشمس تجري لمستقر لها ذلك تقدير العزيز العليم. والقمر قدرناه منازل حتى عاد كالأرجون القديم. لا الشمس ينبغي لها أن تدرك القمر ولا الليل سابق النهار وكل في فلك يسبحون. وآية لهم أنا حملنا ذريتهم في الفلك المشحون وخلقنا لهم من مثله ما يركبون. وإن نشأ نغرقهم فلا صريخ لهم ولا هم ينقذون إلا رحمة منا ومتاعا إلى حين وإذا قيل لهم اتقوا ما بين أيديكم وما خلفكم لعلكم ترحمون وما تأتيهم من آية من آيات ربهم إلا كانوا عنها معرضين وإذا قيل لهم أنفقوا مما رزقكم الله قال الذين كفروا للذين آمنوا أنطعم من لو يشاء الله أطعمه إن أنتم إلا في ضلال مبين ويقولون متى هذا الوعد إن كنتم صادقين ما ينظرون إلا صيحة واحدة تأخذهم وهم يخصمون فلا يستطيعون توصية ولا إلى أهلهم يرجعون ونفخ في الصور فإذا هم من الأجداث إلى ربهم ينسلون قالوا يا ويلنا من بعثنا من مرقدنا هذا ما وعد الرحمن وصدق المرسلون إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم جميع لدينا محضرون فاليوم لا تظلم نفس شيئا ولا تجزون إلا ما كنتم تعملون إن أصحاب الجنة اليوم في شغل فاكهون هم وأزواجهم في ظلال على الأرائك متكئون لهم فيها فاكهة ولهم ما يدعون سلام قولا من رب رحيم وامتازوا اليوم أيها المجرمون ألم أحد إليكم يا بني آدم أن لا تعبدوا الشيطان إنه لكم عدو مبين وأن اعبدوني هذا صراط مستقيم ولقد أضل منكم جبلا كثيرا أفلم تكونوا تعقلون هذه جهنم التي كنتم توعدون اصلوها اليوم بما كنتم تكفرون اليوم نختم على أفواههم وتكلمنا أيديهم وتشهد أرجلهم بما كانوا يكسبون ولو نشاء لطمسنا على أعينهم فاستبقوا الصراط فأنى يبصرون ولو نشاء لمسخناهم على مكانتهم فما استطاعوا مضيا ولا يرجعون ومن نعمره ننكسه في الخلق أفلا يعقلون وما علمناه الشعر وما ينبغي له إن هو إلا ذكر وقرآن مبين لينذر من كان حيا ويحق القول على الكافرين أولم يروا أنا خلقنا لهم مما عملت أيدينا أنعاما فهم لها مالكون وذللناها لهم فمنها ركوبهم ومنها يأكلون ولهم فيها منافع ومشارب أفلا يشكرون واتخذوا من دون الله آلهة لعلهم ينصرون لا يستطيعون نصرهم وهم لهم جند محضرون فلا يحزنك قولهم إنا نعلم ما يسرون وما يعلنون أولم يرى الإنسان أنا خلقناه من نطفة فإذا هو خصيم مبين وضرب لنا مثلا ونسي خلقه قال من يحيي العظام وهي رميم قل يحييها الذي أنشأها أول مرة وهو بكل خلق عليم الذي جعل لكم من الشجر الأخضر نارا فإذا أنتم منه توقدون أوليس الذي خلق السماوات والأرض بقادر على أن يخلق مثلهم بلى وهو الخلاق العليم إنما أمره إذا أراد شيئا أن يقول له كن فيكون فسبحان الذي بيده ملكوت كل شيء وإليه ترجعون سورة المباركة الفاتحة.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم إني أسألك برحمتك التي وسعت كل شيء وبقوتك التي قهرت بها كل شيء وخضع لها كل شيء وذل لها كل شيء وبجبروتك التي غلبت بها كل شيء وبعزتك التي لا يقوم لها شيء وبعظمتك التي ملأت كل شيء وبسلطانك الذي على كل شيء وبوجهك الباقي بعد فناء كل شيء وبأسمائك التي ملأت أركان كل شيء وبعلمك الذي أحاط بكل شيء وبنور وجهك الذي أضاء له كل شيء. يا نور يا قدوس يا أول الأولين ويا آخر الآخرين. اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تهتك العصم. اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تنزل النقم. اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تغير النعم. اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تحبس الدعاء. اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تنزل البلاء. اللهم اغفر لي كل ذنب أذنبته وكل خطيئة أخطأتها. اللهم إني أتقرب إليك بذكرك وأستشفع بك إلى نفسك وأسألك بجودك أن تدنيني من قربك وأن توزعني شكرك وأن تلهمني ذكرك. اللهم إني أسألك سؤال خاضع متذلل خاشع أن تسامحني وترحمني وتجعلني بقسمك راضيا قانعا وفي جميع الأحوال متواضعا. اللهم وأسألك سؤال من اشتدت فاقته وأنزل بك عند الشدائد حاجته وعظم فيما عندك رغبته. اللهم عظم سلطانك وعلى مكانك وخفي مكرك وظهر أمرك وغلب قهرك وجرت قدرتك ولا يمكن الفرار من حكومتك. اللهم لا أجد لذنوبي غافرا ولا لقبائحي ساطرا ولا لشيء من عملي القبيح بالحسن مبدلا غيرك. لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك وبحمدك. ظلمت نفسي وتجرأت بجهلي وسكنت إلى قديم ذكرك لي ومنك علي. اللهم مولاي كم من قبيح سترته وكم من فادح من البلاء أقلته وكم من عثار وقيته وكم من مكروه دفعته وكم من ثناء جميل لست أهلا له نشرته. اللهم عظم بلائي وأفرط بي سوء حالي وقسرت بي أعمالي وقعدت بي أغلالي وحبسني عن نفعي بعد أملي وخدعتني الدنيا بغرورها ونفسي بجنايتها ومطالي. يا سيدي فأسألك بعزتك ألا يحجب عنك دعائي سوء عملي وفعالي، ولا تفضحني بخفي ما اطلعت عليه من سري، ولا تعاجلني بالعقوبة على ما عملته في خلواتي من سوء فعلي وإساءتي ودوام تفريطي وجهالتي وكثرة شهواتي وغفلتي. وكن اللهم بعزتك لي في كل الأحوال رؤوفا، وعلي في جميع الأمور عطوفا. إلهي وربي من لي غيرك، أسأله كشف ضري والنظر في أمري. إلهي ومولاي، أجريت علي حكما اتبعت فيه هوى نفسي، ولم أحترس فيه من تزيين عدوي، فغرني بما أهوى وأسعده على ذلك القضاء، فتجاوزت بما جرى علي من ذلك بعض حدودك، وخالفت بعض أوامرك، فلك الحمد علي في جميع ذلك، ولا حجة لي فيما جرى علي فيه قضاؤك، وألزمني حكمك وبلاؤك. وقد أتيتك يا إلهي بعد تقصيري وإسرافي على نفسي، معتذرا نادما منكسرا مستقيلا، مستغفرا منيبا مقرا مذعنا معترفا، لا أجد مفرا مما كان مني، ولا مفزعا أتوجه إليه في أمري غير قبولك عذري وإدخالك إياي في سعة رحمتك. اللهم فاقبل عذري وارحم شدة ضري، وفكني من شدي وثاقي. يا رب ارحم ضعف بدني ورقة جلدي ودقة عظمي. يا من بدأ خلقي وذكري وتربيتي وبري وتغذيتي، هبني لابتداء كرمك وسالفي برك بي. يا إلهي وسيدي وربي، أتراك معذبي بنارك بعد توحيدك، وبعد ما انطوى عليه قلبي من معرفتك، ولهج به لساني من ذكرك، واعتقده ضميري من حبك، وبعد صدق اعترافي ودعائي خاضعا لربوبيتك. هيهات أنت أكرم من أن تضيع من ربيته، أو تبعد من أدنيته، أو تشرد من آويته، أو تسلم إلى البلاء من كفيته ورحمته. وليت شعري يا سيدي وإلهي ومولاي، أتسلط النار على وجوه خرت لعظمتك ساجدة، وعلى ألسن نطقت بتوحيدك صادقة، وبشكرك مادحة، وعلى قلوب اعترفت بإلهيتك محققة، وعلى ضمائر حوت من العلم بك حتى صارت خاشعة، وعلى جوارح سعت إلى أوطان تعبدك طائعة، وأشارت باستغفارك مذعنة. ما هكذا الظن بك، ولا أخبرنا بفضلك عنك يا كريم. يا ربي وأنت تعلم ضعفي عن قليل من بلاء الدنيا وعقوباتها، وما يجري فيها من المكاره على أهلها، على أن ذلك بلاء ومكروه، قليل مكثوه، يسير بقاؤه، قصير مدته. فكيف احتمالي لبلاء الآخرة وجليل وقوع المكاره فيها، وهو بلاء تطول مدته ويدوم مقامه، ولا يخفف عن أهله لأنه لا يكون إلا عن غضبك وانتقامك وسخطك، وهذا ما لا تقوم له السماوات والأرض. يا سيدي فكيف لي وأنا عبدك الضعيف الذليل الحقير المسكين المستكين. يا إلهي وربي وسيدي ومولاي، لأي الأمور إليك أشكو، ولما منها أضج وأبكي، لأليم العذاب وشدته أم لطول البلاء ومدته؟ فلئن صيرتني للعقوبات مع أعدائك، وجمعت بيني وبين أهل بلائك، وفرقت بيني وبين أحبائك وأوليائك، فهبني يا إلهي وسيدي ومولاي وربي صبرت على عذابك، فكيف أصبر على فراقك؟ وهبني صبرت على حر نارك، فكيف أصبر عن النظر إلى كرامتك؟ أم كيف أسكن في النار ورجائي عفوك؟ فبعزتك يا سيدي ومولاي أقسم صادقا لئن تركتني ناطقة لأذجن إليك بين أهلها ذجيج الآملين، ولأصرخن إليك صراخ المستصرخين، ولأبكين عليك بكاء الفاقدين، ولأنادينك أين كنت يا ولي المؤمنين، يا غاية آمال العارفين، يا غياث المستغيثين، يا حبيب قلوب الصادقين، ويا إله العالمين. أفتراك سبحانك يا إلهي وبحمدك تسمع فيها صوت عبد مسلم سجن فيها بمخالفته، وذاك تعمى عذابها بمعصيته، وحبس بين أطباقها بجرمه وجريرته، وهو يضج إليك ضجيج مؤمل لرحمتك، ويناديك بلسان أهل توحيدك، ويتوسل إليك بربوبيتك. يا مولاي فكيف يبقى في العذاب وهو يرجو ما سلف من حلمك؟ أم كيف تولمه النار وهو يأمل فضلك ورحمتك؟ أم كيف يهرقه لهيبها وأنت تسمع صوته وترى مكانه؟ أم كيف يشتمل عليه زفيرها وأنت تعلم ضعفا؟ أم كيف يتقلقل بين أطباقها وأنت تعلم صدقا؟ أم كيف تزجره زبانيتها وهو يناديك يا ربا؟ أم كيف يرجو فضلك في عتقه منها فتتركه فيها؟ هيهات ما ذلك الظن بك، ولا المعروف من فضلك، ولا مشبه لما عملت به الموحدين من برك وإحسانك. فباليقين أقطع لولا ما حكمت به من تعظيم جاحدك، وقضيت به من إخلاد معاندك، لجعلت النار كلها بردا وسلاما، وما كانت لأحد فيها مقرا ولا مقاما. لكنك تقدست أسماؤك أقسمت أن تملأها من الكافرين من الجنة والناس أجمعين، وأن تخلد فيها المعاندين. وأنت جل ثناؤك قلت مبتدئا، وتتولت بالإنعام متكرما، أفمن كان مؤمنا كمن كان فاسقا لا يستوون. إلهي وسيدي فأسألك بالقدرة التي قدرتها، وبالقضية التي حتمتها وحكمتها وغلبت من عليه أجريتها، أن تهب لي في هذه الليلة وفي هذه الساعة كل جرم أجرمت وكل ذنب أذنبت، وكل قبيح أسررته وكل جهل عملته كتمته أو أعلنته أخفيته أو أظهرته وكل سيئة أمرت بإثباتها الكرام الكاتبين الذين وكلتهم بحفظ ما يكون مني وجعلتهم شهودا علي مع جوارحي وكنت أنت الرقيب علي من ورائهم والشاهد لما خفي عنهم وبرحمتك أخفيت وبفضلك سترت وأن توفر حظي من كل خير أنزلت أو إحسان فضلت أو بر نشرت أو رزق بسطت أو ذنب تغفره أو خطأ تستره يا ربي يا ربي يا رب يا إلهي وسيدي ومولاي ومالك رقي يا من بيده ناصيتي يا عليما بضري ومسكنتي يا خبيرا بفقري وفاقتي يا ربي يا ربي يا رب أسألك بحقك وقدسك وعظم صفاتك وأسمائك أن تجعل أوقاتي من الليل والنهار بذكرك معمورة وبخدمتك موصولة وأعمالي عندك مقبولة حتى تكون أعمالي وأورادي كلها وردا واحدا وحالي في خدمتك سرمدا يا سيدي يا من عليه معولي يا من إليه شكوت أحوالي يا ربي يا ربي يا رب قو على خدمتك جواره واشدد على العزيمة جوانه وهب لي الجد في خشيته والدوام في الاتصال بخدمتك حتى أسرح إليك في ميادين السابقين وأسرع إليك في البارزين وأشتاق إلى قربك في المشتاقين وأدنو منك ذنو المخلصين وأخافك مخافة الموقنين وأجتمع في جوارك مع المؤمنين اللهم ومن أرادني بسوء فأرد ومن كادني فكد واجعلني من أحسن عبيدك نصيبا عندك وأقربهم منزلة منك وأخصهم زلفة لديك فإنه لا ينال ذلك إلا بفضلك وجد لي بجودك واعطف علي بمجدك واحفظني برحمتك واجعل لساني بذكرك لهجا وقلبي بحبك متيما ومن علي بحسن إجابتك وأقلني عثرتي واغفر زلتي فإنك قضيت على عبادك بعبادتك وأمرتهم بدعائك وضمنت لهم الإجابة فإليك يا ربي نصبت وجهي وإليك يا ربي مددت يدي فبعزتك استجب لي دعائي وبلغني منايا ولا تقطع من فضلك رجائي واكفني شر الجن والإنس من أعدائي يا سريع الرضا اغفر لمن لا يملك إلا الدعاء فإنك فعال لما تشاء يا من اسمه دواء وذكره شفاء وطاعته غنى ارحم رأس ماله الرجاء وسلاحه البكاء يا سابغ النعم يا دافع النقام يا نور المستوحشين في الظلم يا عالما لا يعلم صل على محمد وآل محمد وافعل بي ما أنت أهله وصلى الله على رسوله والأئمة الميامين من آله وسلم تسليما كثيرا. الفاتحة.
Sayyid Shabbir Kirmani, respected elders, brothers and sisters in Iman, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Surah Fatiha is requested for the Isal Sawab of Marhumin listed on the screen and for all Marhumin. Al-Fatiha. Amma Yujibu is requested for the names listed on the screen and for all those in need here and elsewhere. Let's recite together 5 times Amma Yujibu. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Amma yujibu al-mustarra iza da'a wa yakshifu as-su'. أما يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء 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 اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Khums Ijaza, we wish to inform you that we continue to have official authorization to collect khums dues to be used fully towards the running and maintenance of Masjid al-Hayy. You may fulfill your obligated religious dues by generously supporting Masjid al-Hayy. More details are listed on the screen. At this time, I would like to invite Sayyid Shabbir Kirmani to recite tonight's Majlis. Salawat ala Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala
اللهم صل. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. فوضوا أمري إلى الله إن الله بصير بالعباد ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. حسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل ونعم المولى ونعم النصير. والصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على الرسول المسدد المصطفى الأمجد المحمود الأحمد الذي سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرض بأبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. وعلى أهل بيت الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين المنتجبين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. وقل رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. أما بعد، قال الله تبارك وتعالى في كتاب الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ألم تر كيف فعل ربك بأصحاب الفيل. صدق الله العلي العظيم. زينوا مجالسكم بالصلوات على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. My respected elders, brothers and sisters in Islam here in Florida, across the globe, wherever you're hearing my voice, Salamun alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Question: what is true power? We've been discussing the life and times of the Holy Prophet of Islam. We've been discussing his ancestors, and we've gotten to a point where we are currently discussing his grandfather. That is, we said that the father of the Prophet is Hazrat Abdullah, and his father is Abdul Muttalib. And we said that, recapping in the conversation, because we had one gap in between, we discussed that it started, the story narrations began with Hazrat Ibrahim. That is, with Nabi Ibrahim and his wife and his lineage, that is with
Hazrat Ismail, this progeny continued in the region, and we said after some generations after Ismail, there came an individual who came forward and re-established and brought together the factions into one form, and we said that was Qusay. And Qusay, they say, is from the line of Adnan. Adnan, there's a debate whether he was from the line directly of Ismail or it was an uncle or type of relationship down the line. Nonetheless, leaving that to the side, Qusay, after him comes Abdul Manaf, and then we said the progenies had split into two factions. And I should mention to you, there are different views amongst the scholars and the ulama on these things, and we've been trying to share with you those which are most generally accepted by the Shia scholars. Some we have included because they are prominent, some because they are more authentic, and some because, for example, in the interest of time, we may even have omitted. And we've been trying to keep this conversation moving forward because we said this conversation is so important for two reasons at least, if not more. And we said this is important to answer external opposition that may come with respect to Rasulullah. The people may say that Muhammad was a warmonger, as you're saying, the likes of, for example, Jordan Peterson, who many people in our society listen to today. He says that, for example, there's one thing that I cannot reconcile about Muhammad. This psychologist, who's been at Harvard and other institutions, he said the one thing I cannot reconcile about Muhammad versus Jesus, he says that by any measure, his words, not mine, he said Muhammad was a warmonger. He says Jesus was not. We have to answer this because people need to understand what was the story in the life of times of Rasulullah. This has been going on since the time of Dante, where Dante in his Inferno, roughly 400 years ago, when he writes and he puts people in hell, he puts Rasulullah in the pits of hell. Why? What did he think about Rasulullah? What is Dante thinking? So we have to be able to understand Rasulullah's true ethos and his true message, so we can answer those who are not Muslim, number one. Number two, we need to be able to have this conversation within Islam. That is, who is Rasulullah? You will find that if you go back maybe 60, 70, 100 years ago in the history of Islam, in the general Muslim community, there was still more respect of Rasulullah. I asked the question, how many masajids are in Orlando? How many masajids are in, for example, Florida? How many houses of God? And every year, whenever the time comes of the celebration and the commemoration of the birth of Rasulullah, how many of them commemorate? How many allow and permit you to commemorate the birth of Rasulullah? Did you not used to do it when you used to live in Egypt, or your fathers used to live in Egypt? Did you not used to commemorate it when you used to live in Pakistan or India or other parts of the world? What Sharia came when you came to the United States where things started to change? We need to be able to give and instill that confidence in every Muslim, Shia or non-Shia, about the true personality of Rasulullah. Rasulullah is the walking, talking Islam. If we don't understand the life and times of Rasulullah, we truly don't understand the essence of Islam. Therefore, it's part and parcel. If the Muslim world had the respect of Rasulullah, we would not face many of the issues we're facing today. But we have denigrated the position of Rasulullah, unfortunately, in our society today. Therefore, for these several reasons, the story, the life and times in the life of Rasulullah is of the utmost importance, perhaps now more than ever. I am one of the biggest proponents of unity amongst Muslims. I am the follower of Sayyid Sistani. I am the follower where Sayyid Sistani says that they are our own nafs. However, no marja has ever said there's a compromise on principles or there is a compromise on belief systems. So my goal is to just try to bring those narrations from Ahl Sunnah references, non-Shia references that have been stated about the life and times and the honor and the prestige of Rasulullah. Therefore, moving the conversation along today, I want to look at a few things. That is, what was that momentous event in the life and times of the grandfather of Rasulullah, that is Abdul Muttalib, that all historians have documented and gives and sheds some light into the monotheistic belief of the ancestors of Rasulullah. What happened and what was that incident? Number two, what was the history of religion in the Arab belt, that is in Yemen, in, for example, Mecca, in Yathrib, and this environment? Were there Christians there or not? Were there Jews there or not? How did they come there? How did they end up in this environment? Number two. Number three, what was that incident where someone marched an army towards Mecca? And who was that individual and what guidance does it give us in this time about how it relates to our world? And finally, how did this momentous incident, which we'll come to in a few moments, that happened around this incident that we'll cover, how did that coincide with the life and times of the messenger of Rasulullah in the most beautiful and incredible of ways? This is our agenda in the brief moments that we are here together, wherever you are, here in Florida, across the globe. Send a salawat on Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma sallam. At the first level, when we come to the line of Abdul Muttalib, the grandfather of Rasulullah, we said that he was brought back from Yathrib or from Medina back towards Mecca by his uncle, his uncle's name was Muttalib. And when he entered into the city, back into Mecca, when his uncle Muttalib, after his father had passed away, when his uncle came and retrieved him and brought him back towards Mecca, they said, "Who is this boy that you've brought with you?" And he said, "This is my servant." So his name stuck as Abdul Muttalib, the servant of Muttalib. And as time progressed, historians said there were at least 3 major accomplishments or incidents in the life of Abdul Muttalib that are noteworthy. For example, number 1, we said it was the reopening of Zamzam, the reestablishing of Zamzam. We mentioned last time that Zamzam was something that was flowing, and it was flowing from the time of Hajar and Ismail. But what happened was Hajar and Ismail, they lived there. But after some time, Nabi Ismail married into Banu Jurham. When he married into Banu Jurham, that tribe was the one that was controlling Zamzam. But after time, the other tribes said, "Look, we have more number. We are in greater number," and they overthrew and they removed Banu Jurham. Banu Jurham said, "Look, if we're not going to be ruling, no one's going to be ruling," and then they filled up Zamzam. At that point in time, Allah entrusted the reopening and the reestablishing of Zamzam into the hands of Abdul Muttalib through his children. That was number 1. Number 2, and the whole incident is in front of you, not to repeat it. Number 2 was the sacrifice that he came forward with, where he was saying, Allah, if you give me children, if you give me sons, I will sacrifice one of them in your way. And last time, we gave the incident where it was 100 camels to Abdullah. And Abdullah survived, and Abdullah stayed around. The third incident that the historians mark with respect to the life and times of Abdul Muttalib is the event of the elephant. That is, the year that is known as Amul Fil, that all historians have marks the birth year of Rasulullah. That incident, which is very famous and very known. However, what really happened? What was the history around that? Why did Abraha come from Yemen towards Mecca? What led up to that? When he came, what happened when he got there? And after he got there, how did he leave, and in which state did he leave from Mecca? All of these questions need to be answered, and all of these things need to be looked at, so we here know and the next generations know what was the history of what happened during that era and that year and that time. Why is this so important? Number 1, the first reason is because the calendar was not so developed at that time, during the time of the Arabs. Today we have the Gregorian calendar, we have the lunar calendar, we have the solar calendar, we have so many different calendars, we have the Chinese calendar, we have different ways of keeping track of time. But if that time, during the time of the Arabs, particularly in Mecca and Medina, in this area, time was not well documented, at least not according to historians. So major events used to occur, and they would say this was the year of X, this was the year of Y, this was the year where this happened. Similar to our world, for example, you may ask, in our world today, we're living in BC eras, for example, right? Before COVID, that was a whole different time. And now we're AC, after COVID. What is life like? Is it even after COVID or not? Whenever that is. So there were these incidents. Even if you ask many youth, for example, there are certain times everyone remembers where they were. For example, you ask anyone, where were you during 9/11? Everyone will know where they were at that time, where they heard the news. You ask someone, youth especially, you ask them, where were you when you heard that Kobe Bryant, the athlete, died? Everyone knows, for example. I remember I was lecturing in Allentown at that time. And many others remember, they remember exactly the time and date. I was lecturing in Los Angeles. Every person in the city of Los Angeles knows when that happened, where they were at that point in time. Similarly, if you go to the era of the Arabs, they did nothing, but they knew particularly when was the era and time when the event in the year of the elephant happened, the event of the elephant. What was this, and what were the circumstances surrounding it? And what does it say about the iman and the belief of Abdul Muttalib? Allow me to explain. Historians say roughly 300 years after Jesus, 300 years after Nabi Isa. That is approximately 340, 350 BC, after the death of Nabi Isa. Now remember, the early Christians are persecuted, much like the early Muslims were persecuted. And so what ended up happening was, it was not until Constantine came forward and established his empire and made the Roman Empire Christian that the predominant Christian religion began to flourish. Now stay with me here. Historians say Yemen was a place where many different tribes and wars would take place. Conquerors would come, take over Yemen, and they would leave. One conqueror would come and take over. So many different religions came through Yemen. People were idolaters, people were monotheists, people were this, people were that, based on whoever was the ruler and the conqueror of the time. They say in the 340s what happened, Abyssinia, which is modern day Ethiopia and Eritrea and this area of Africa, they were Christians who were there. And they went and they conquered over Yemen. And they established Christianity in Yemen at that time. So people began to believe in Christianity at this time. However, according to historians, they said this lasted for roughly 40 more years or so. And then eventually what happened, there were certain tribes that were in Yemen that were pure Arabs. There are three theories as to who are Arabs. One, according to the narrations and according to verse of the Quran, Arabs were Ad and Thamud. But they were destroyed by Allah, so they were wiped out. This is one category. The other category of Arabs were those Arabs who were Arabized. They were not originally naturally Arab, but they lived amongst Arabs and they stayed there for so many years that, for example, they became Arab. You go to the Emirates or the Gulf, for example, not everyone was originally from that location. Maybe 200 years ago some people came, maybe 400 years ago some people came, maybe 500 years ago some people came to that part of the region and then they became locals, for example. And a third category were those who are called Himyari Arabs. Himyari Arabs were those purest blood Arabs, according to the Arabs. There were certain tribes that were the Himyari Arab tribes in Yemen. They eventually overtook and overcame the Abyssinians who had come and established Christianity in their land. And they pushed them out and they took over the rulership again. When they took over the rulership again of Yemen, they had an affinity, a closeness towards not Christianity, but Judaism. They had adopted Judaism and they wanted the subjects of their kingdom of Yemen to also become Jewish. Remember, I've told you this and you know this better than I do by now, that whenever rulers were ruling, they used religion as a vehicle of power. And so it was in their advantage and they wanted one religion to be ruling over the entire kingdom. We gave the example of Akbar, the Indian ruler, the Mughal ruler. We gave the example of Constantine. We gave many other examples. Similarly, there was a particular ruler whose name was Yunus al-Himyari. This person was trying to make the entire Yemen, he comes to power, and they say this happened around the 5th century, 500 years after Nabi Isa, 500 years after Christ, roughly 523. He comes to power. When he comes to power, he wants to make his entire empire Jewish. The people are Christian. They say, no, we will not give up our faith. We will not give up Christianity. We are Christians. So what does he do? He lines the city of Yemen, the cities of Yemen and the towns of Yemen with trenches, khandaqs, trenches. And he orders for fires to be lit ablaze. And then he takes the people who are Christians, who are the subjects, who are refusing to become Jewish, and he throws them into the ditches and the trenches of fire and kills them, all of them. Mass bloodshed. Surah Buruj of the Quran alludes to this, about this, what happened here. And all of this bloodshed occurs and it's a bloodbath. When this happens, after some time, according to historians, with the backing of the Roman Empire, with the backing of the Byzantium Empire, who was Christian at that time by the way of Constantine and others, they gave a backing to Abyssinian tribes to take over Yemen once again. The Christians, Abyssinian Christians. When they took over, they had an army backing them. They crushed the Jewish tribes, that is, the tribes that were now ruling over Yemen, the Arab Himyaris, they crushed them and they took over power. When they took over the power, there was one general who was a general of Abyssinian descent. He was Abyssinian, that is Ethiopian by origin. His name was Abraha. He was a general. He then eventually took over the leadership of Yemen. because Yemen had become a state of the Roman Empire, a smaller state. So you can think of it sort of like Napoleon. Napoleon was a general, but also a ruler. Abraha was a general turned ruler. So he's a general as well as a governor of the state of Yemen, which has now become Christian at this point in time. Now, when Abraha is ruling and he's the head of Yemen, at that point in time, as an environment, you have to think about different things. You have to think about the politics, you have to think about the economics. How can you help people flourish? How can you help people survive? How can you help people live a better life? Otherwise they say that what kind of ruler are you? What kind of leader are you? What are you doing for society? So he said, hold on. I noticed that all of these different tribes from Yemen, they go on a trade route. As you know, the trade route from Yemen to Syria was well known. Rasulullah and Abu Talib used to go down that route, and other merchants and businessmen used to go up and down that route. So he said, where are all these people going? I see them all going to trade routes. He says, where are they going? Abraha asks. He says, look, from Yemen, they are going towards Mecca. He says, Mecca? What's in Mecca? He said, Mecca. In Mecca, they claim there is the house of God, the Bayt of God, the house of God. So people go for pilgrimage there. When people go for pilgrimage there, they give their offerings there. People come from all over, and people do business there, people do trade there, and people do worship and pilgrimage there. He said, really? He thought to himself, this looks like a good economic opportunity. That is, people are flooding to Mecca. They're going there in order to do the pilgrimage, and then the tribes come there and they do business there. Sounds like a good idea. He said, this is the house of God, they say? He said, yes, they say this is the house of God. So he said, how can I replicate that here in Yemen? He decided to build a huge church, like a cathedral, if one may say. You know, Notre Dame that was in Paris, for example, that went up in flame a few years ago. He said, I'm going to build a huge church. By the way, the same way that mosques have a philosophy behind the architecture that I've told you before. For example, they were made very big. The Mughal or the Badshahi mosques in India and Pakistan that you will find, or for example, the different ones throughout the world, they were meant to be large, with a large courtyard, with a large dome. It was to remind you of the presence of God and how small we are in the grand scheme of things. Similarly, the cathedrals and the churches like Notre Dame and others that are not built as much anymore, they used to have very high ceilings. And the reason they had very high ceilings was that when you went into the church, it was supposed to remind you how small you are in the grand scheme of God, and how little you are, and how minuscule you are, and how great and grand is God Almighty. Nonetheless, he said, I want a church built, I want a cathedral built, I want a magnanimous church built. So they built it. At that point in time, when they were building it and when they had built it, the news reached Mecca. They said, do you know what's going on in Yemen? He was building in Sana'a, in Yemen. He said, do you know what's happening in Sana'a? The Arab tribes there, the Quraysh and others are saying, what's being built there? He said, they built a huge church, and people are going to go, they're not going to come to the Kaaba anymore. They're going to go to the church in Yemen. Now remember, you have to know history, you have to know politics, you have to know economics. If you read, for example, the history of certain places have never had an economy. According to economists and historians, that some places need war, they need bloodshed. Otherwise, they need some other way to keep their economy going. This is what economists have said. They've given examples of certain places. Nonetheless, when you come to this example, they said that if Mecca, people don't come to the house of God, if they don't come to the Kaaba, the entire economy of Mecca will collapse. Because there's nothing else there. There's no other reason for anyone to come. It's a barren desert land. At that point in time, when this news reached, the tribes in Mecca became very worried. When the tribes in Mecca became very worried, there was one person who was from Banu Kinana, according to the historians. He got very upset and he went down to Yemen. When he went down to Yemen, the historians write that he disrespected the church that had been built by Abraha. When he disrespected, historians have not detailed how he disrespected. What did he do? Did he do something we can't speak of or something else? Whatever he did, he disrespected it. When this news reached the ear of Abraha, the general / ruler of Yemen, he said, very well. Now one solution could have been he punished that individual individually. But he said, no. As today, as was at that time, for many people war is profitable. He said, hold on, this is a huge opportunity. He said, what will you do? He said, we will march from Yemen with an army of 60,000 to go towards Mecca. We will not only destroy them, we will demoralize them. Meaning, they will never have the audacity to rise again. This is not something new. In fact, if you read the history of World War II, when World War II happened, the when the Germans were defeated, the Allied force, the forces, for example, of the United Kingdom, the United States and others, they said, we need to do something to Germany that they will never be able to rise again. Therefore they said, you cannot have an army. You will not have an army. So this was to demoralize them that they never do what they did again. Even in law, there's something called punitive damages. Punitive damages is something to deter others to never do this again. For example, when the Exxon Valdez spill happened, many of you may remember that. There was one damages for the damages that have happened, the life that has been lost, the businesses that have suffered. That's one damage that you pay. The other damage that they had to pay was so that anyone who's watching never lets this happen again. Similarly, he said, I will give them a reckoning. Abraha says that they will never forget. So he takes 60,000 and he takes elephants with him. Now these Arabs had not seen these elephants before. So he takes his army and they march. And I'm condensing in the interest of time. There's much to say here. So they march. When they march, eventually they are heading towards Mecca. But on the way, they stop on their way to Taif. You remember, Rasulullah used to do tabligh in Taif. That is one of the first places he used to go for tabligh. And they used to pelt him with stones. When they got towards Taif, Banu Thaqif was there. Banu Thaqif sees an army of 60,000 and they see all these elephants and they get shocked. They started to ask and figure out, what is this? Oh, remember, we heard the news that there was a man from Banu Kanana who went and disrespected the church. This must be Abraha. So they preemptively, they got up and they anticipated what was going to happen and they sent their messengers. And they said, look. We think we know where you're going. You're trying to head to Mecca. You're trying to go to Banu Kinana. You're trying to go to those people who disrespected your church. We are not those people. We are Taif. We're a different city. We're away. So Abraha says, very well. In which direction is Taif? Or is Mecca from Taif? He says, very well. This direction. He says, very well. According to historians, he continued on his route towards Mecca. But when he was getting closer to Mecca, he didn't go directly. He camped outside of Mecca, on the outskirts. Historians say generals often used to do this throughout history. For example, if you read the history of the Medicis and others, other conquering armies would set up camp a few hundred miles or a few miles outside of the city to first plan and analyze what they're going to do. So when this happened, he did not go directly into Mecca. He was on the outskirts, Abraha. And he ordered his men to see what you can do. And so his men went and they for example, damaged property and they did this and they did that. And then they took over 200 camels. They stole 200 camels from Mecca and they came back, or around Mecca. And they came back. Abraha said, very well. So he's sitting in his camp. He says, look, we know what our goal is. We know what we're planning to do. He says, look, I want you to go and call for me the chieftain, the head of the Meccan tribes, who at that time, of course, was Abdul Muttalib. Abdul Muttalib has the honor, the keys to the Kaaba. He has the prestige. He has the sons. He has everything. He's responsible for giving water to the pilgrims. He's responsible for all of these things. So he was the chief. At that point in time, it reached the news, the ear. This is on the outskirts of Mecca. In Mecca, the news reaches the ear of Abdul Muttalib that what has happened is 200 of his camels have been stolen. Those camels that Abraha's men took belonged to Abdul Muttalib. Abdul Muttalib said, really? He said, yes. He said, okay. Who? Where? He said, okay. They said, outskirts of the city. He said, very well. Abdul Muttalib was on his way. So on the outskirts of the city, Abraha is saying, I want to speak to the chief. And inside the city was Abdul Muttalib. He said, where's my camels? Very well. He went. So from this side, Abdul Muttalib is coming and Abraha is summoning for the chief. At that point in time, when Abdul Muttalib gets there, the narrations and historians say that Abraha doesn't know that this is the person who is the chief of the Arabs and the tribes of Mecca. But he sees him and he stands up and he looks at him and he says that and they begin to talk briefly. He says, your mannerism of talking, your grace, your presence, it tells me that surely, Abraha is saying to Abdul Muttalib, surely you must be the leader of these tribes. He didn't know. They did not told him that this is Abdul Muttalib. He says that your honor, your dignity, your grace, the way you walk, the way you talk, the way you stand, it tells me, it shows me that you are someone who is the leader of these tribes. Now hold on a second. I started this conversation by saying that this event tells us something deeply about Abdul Muttalib and also the ancestors of Rasulullah. So what happened? Abraha says, look, with your dignity, with your honor, with your prestige, I will give you whatever you ask. What do you ask? What do you want? I will grant you your wish, Abraha says. Now Abraha is thinking, look, he knows, I know, the whole city knows that I've come to destroy the Kaaba. Everyone knows this. It's not a hidden, everyone knows. At that point in time, he says, look, what is he going to ask? So Abdul Muttalib says, look, I've received news that I had 200 camels, and these 200 camels that your men have confiscated and taken away from me. I want those back. Abraha, the historians say, Abraha was shocked. And Abraha said, you're asking about your camels? He got upset. He said, you have fallen in my eyes. Your position, your prestige has fallen in my eyes. Abdul Muttalib. So what? Why? He says, I have come to destroy your Kaaba, what you call the house of God. And now I give you the opportunity to get sanctuary, to ask me to forgive you, to take over this. And you come to me asking about your 200 camels? He looks right back at him and he says, look, I am the Rabb, I am the caretaker, I am the nurturer of these camels. That house that you have come to destroy, it has a nurturer, it has a caretaker, it has someone who it belongs to. That person, that entity will take care of his house. And I will take care of what's mine. I ask you that you give me back my camel. This tells us the iman of the ancestors of Rasulullah. That he knew that this was the house of God. At that point in time, he said, very well. You take your camels, you go. At that point in time, Abdul Muttalib left. Abraha is enraged. He's ordering his men, I want you to go and ambush and destroy the city with these elephants. Trample over people, they won't be able to stop you. Now look, elephants at that time were the most advanced technology. Today, for example, people use drones and other things in war and combat, and they use these big aircraft carriers and all of these different things and technology. That was the biggest technology that you had at the time, these elephants. The Arabs of Quraysh at that time could not compete. There was no way. But when Abdul Muttalib left, according to historians, after the conversation between Abdul Muttalib and Abraha, after that historians say that there was a moment in time where Abdul Muttalib, he called on his son. He looked at his servant, he says, call my son. Now by this time, he had many sons, as you know. I said at least 10 sons Allah had given him. He said, call my son. They sent one of the sons. Some historians say it was Abbas, some say other. He says, no, call my son, call my son. So it wasn't Abbas, so another one came. He says, call my son. Who came? Abu Talib. He said, no, call my son. Second time, again he said, no, call my son. According to historians, the third time came Abdullah, the father of Rasulullah. Now remember, there was a light of prophethood that was being transferred from the loins and that was visible from the forehead. Now, he called on Abdullah, he said, Abdullah, yes. Abdullah, I want you to do something. Abdul Muttalib is saying, the grandfather of Rasulullah is saying to the father of Rasulullah. He says, Abdullah, I want you to go to Qohe Abi Qawais. There is a mount that is called Qohe Abi Qawais. At that point in time, which will come up again in history and you'll know where. He says, look, go to the mountain and face the sea, which would perhaps be the Arabian Sea. He says, face towards the sea. Go up on the mount and face towards the sea. And in the distance you will see something. And I want you to, once you see it, I want you to come down and I want you to report that to me. Let me know what you see. Abdul Muttalib says to Abdullah. Abdullah says, very well, my father. Abdullah gets up and he goes to Qohe Abu Qawais. He goes to the mount of Abu Qawais. When he gets to the mount of Abu Qawais, he looks directly towards the sea. He looks westward. When he looks westward towards the sea, the Arabian Sea, what does he see in the distance? He sees a swarm of birds, the likes of which he's never seen. In fact, the narrations say it looked like a wave. It looked like the ocean was in the sky. A black, dark ocean was coming from the distance. And what was there? There's small little birds. And each one of these birds had the 3 little pebbles that were the size of maybe a little small dried peas. One in the mouth and one in each of its claws. Each one had 3. And they were coming from the distance. Abdullah sees this. Subhanallah. Abdullah, according to historians, the father of Rasulullah, he descends from the mount of Abu Qawais, this huge, he sees the birds coming from the distance. He descends, and the historians say he circumambulates and does tawaf around the Kaaba 7 times. And after that he goes between Safa and Marwa 7 times. And then he comes to tell his father Abdul Muttalib what he has seen, what he has viewed. And what happened at that moment in time? Then the army that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent of birds, they began to shovel and they began to pelt with stones the elephants and Abraha's army. And they had no chance. In fact, the historians say that the pebbles were falling with such speed that they were piercing the skin of the army. But not everyone died. This is important to know historically. Not the entire army of Abraha died. In fact, historians say Abraha himself lived. And Allah allowed him to live so that he goes back to Yemen, he goes back to his people as a sign of Ibrah, so they understand. This was the iman of Abdul Muttalib, the confidence that he had, that these different things would be taken care of by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and indeed they were. In fact, there are some narrations that say that of these birds, this swarm of birds that came, Allah kept one to the side. Why? Allah kept one to the side according to ulama in terms of the narrations of the Ahlul Bayt, that there was someone else who was going to be an opponent. Who was that? Haris bin Nu'man al-Fahri. Haris bin Nu'man al-Fahri was the one at the event of Ghadir, when Rasulullah said that I am appointing Ali as the wali after me. And at that point in time, Haris stood up and he said, look, is this from you or is this from Allah? And if this is from you, I reject it. And if this is from Allah, may He send an azab right now. That stone that descended, according to some ulama, that came from one of the ababil that had been kept to the side. That's why the Quran says, Alam tara kayfa fa'ala rabbuka bi ashabil fil. Do you not know, do you not remember, do you not recollect what Allah did to the people or the companions of the elephants? How He destroyed this? Why was this example given? Because there was no one in Arabia who could forget that moment. People made many allegations against Rasulullah, but no one ever said that we forgot about what happened at the event or the year of Am al-Fil. Because everyone knew that as clear as day. Proof and evidence of the message of Rasulullah. Proof and evidence. That's why these are miraculous. I'm slowly answering these questions about people saying that, oh, Rasulullah would only go on trade routes to Syria and hear from rabbis and priests, and he would compile and create this Quran. Then answer this, for example. And numerous other things that we'll get to over time. I'm out of time, inshallah, another time. We'll continue next time. But if people knew, remember, these animosities that took place in Karbala were very old. Badrin Shahidu. Remember, Yazid recited poetry. He said, I wish my ancestors were here from Badr and Uhud, so they could see what had happened and how I took revenge. Because remember, the wealthy of Mecca, when Islam came, were the biggest opponents. Abu Sufyan was one of the most well-to-do at the time. He was the last one to accept Islam. And that was only because he had to. His line was taking revenge of what happened during Islam, before Islam, and the ancestors of Rasulullah's era and time. I'm not saying this. The books of our brothers in Islam, ulama have compiled 40 different references from 40 different books about what happened to the Ahlul Bayt. Azadaro, हम आयाम फातिमिया में हैं. 2 जुमले अर्ज करूंगा मसाइब के. आज शब जुमा है. रिवायतों में मिलता है कि बीबी फातिमतुज़ ज़हरा के साथ क्या जुल्म हुआ. अल्लामा इब्न जुबैरी शिया आलिम नहीं है. अल्लामा इब्न जुबैरी ने फरमाया कि रसूलुल्लाह कहाँ हैं. रसूलुल्लाह हैं और बीबी फातिमा 5 बरस की हैं, और बीबी फातिमतुज़ ज़हरा रसूलुल्लाह के सामने गुजरते हैं. और क्या होता है, रिवायतों में मिलता है, अल्लामा इब्न जुबैरी कहते हैं कि रसूलुल्लाह जब फातिमतुज़ ज़हरा को देखते हैं, रसूलुल्लाह रोने लगते हैं. ये क्या माजरा है या रसूलुल्लाह, कि आप क्यों रो रहे हैं जब आपकी बेटी जो आपने खुद कहा फातिमा बवातुम मिन्नी, आप उनको देख के क्यों रो रहे हैं? अल्लामा जुबैरी कहते हैं कि मैं इसलिए रो रहा हूं, रसूलुल्लाह कहते हैं मैं इसलिए रो रहा हूं कि ये उम्मत मेरी बेटी के साथ क्या करेगी, मेरे बेटी के साथ क्या होगा उसके बाद जब मेरी रहलत हो जाएगी, ये क्या होगा? उन्होंने कहा, असहाब ने कहा या रसूलुल्लाह क्या होगा? उन्होंने कहा, रसूलुल्लाह ने कहा ये फातिमा जो मैंने कहा उम्मे अबीहा, जो मैंने कहा फातिमा बवातुम मिन्नी, इसके बाद लोग फातिमा के दरवाजे पे आएंगे और इस हालत में आएंगे कि आग लेके आएंगे, और इस हालत में आएंगे कि इसका एक बच्चा होगा जिसका नाम मोहसिन होगा, वो शहीद हो जाएगा। ये उम्मत मेरी बेटी का ख्याल नहीं रखेगी। अला लअनतुल्लाहि अलल कौम ज़ालिमीन व सयअलमुल लज़ीना ज़लमू अय्य मुनक़लिबिन यनक़लिबून इन्ना लिल्लाहि व इन्ना इलैहि राजिऊन। सूरतुल मुबारकतुल फ़ातिहा मअस सलावात। अल्लाहुम्मा सल्लि अला
ज़ियारत वारिस। बिस्मिल्लाहिर्रहमानिर्रहीम। अल्लाहुम्मा सल्लि अला मुहम्मदिन व आलि मुहम्मद। अस्सलामु अलैका या रसूलल्लाह, अस्सलामु अलैका या अमीरल मोमिनीन व सय्यिदुल वसीय्यीन, अस्सलामु अलैका या फातिमतुज़ ज़हरा सय्यिदती निसाइल आलमीन, अस्सलामु अलैका या खदीजतुल कुबरा, अस्सलामु अलैका या हसनुल मुज्तबा व रहमतुल्लाहि व बरकातुहू, अस्सलामु अलैका या वारिस आदम सफ़वतिल्लाह, अस्सलामु अलैका या वारिस नूहिन नबिय्यिल्लाह, अस्सलामु अलैका या वारिस इब्राहीम खलीलिल्लाह, अस्सलामु अलैका या वारिस मूसा कलीमिल्लाह, अस्सलामु अलैका या वारिस ईसा रूहिल्लाह, अस्सलामु अलैका या वारिस मुहम्मदिन सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि व आलिहि हबीबिल्लाह, अस्सलामु अलैका या वारिस अमीरुल मोमिनीन अलैहिस्सलाम वलिय्यिल्लाह, अस्सलामु अलैका इब्न मुहम्मदिन मुस्तफ़ा, अस्सलामु अलैका इब्न अलीय्यिन मुर्तज़ा, अस्सलामु अलैका इब्न फ़ातिमतुज़ ज़हरा, अस्सलामु अलैका इब्न खदीजतुल कुबरा, अस्सलामु अलैका या सारल्लाहि व इब्न सारिही वल वित्रल मौतूर, अशहदु अन्नका क़द अक़मतस सलात व अन्तस व आतैतज़ ज़कात व अमरत बिल मारूफ व नहैत अनिल मुनकर व अताअतल्लाह व रसूलहु हत्ता अताकल यकीन, फलानल्लाहु उम्मतन क़तलतका वलानल्लाहु उम्मतन ज़लमतका वलानल्लाहु उम्मतन समिअत बिज़ालिका फ़रज़ियत बि। या मौला या अबा अब्दिल्लाह, अशहदु अन्नका कुन्त नूरन फ़िल अस्लाबि शामिख़ा वल अरहामिल मुत्तहहरा, लम तुनज्जिस्कल जाहिलिय्यतु बिअंजासिहा वलम तुलबिस्का मिन मुतलइम्माति सियाबिहा, व अशहदु अन्नका मिन दाइमिद्दीन व अरकानिल मुअमिनीन, व अशहदु अन्नका इमामुल बर्रुत तकियुर रज़ियुज़ ज़कियुल हादियुल महदी, व अशहदु अन्नल अइम्मत मिन वल्दिका कलिमतुत तक़वा व अलामुल हुदा वल उर्वतुल वुस्क़ा वल हुज्जतु अला अहलिद दुनिया, व अशहदुल्लाह मलाइकतहु व अंबियाअहु व रुसुलहु अन्नी बिकुम मुमिन व बिया बिकुम मूकिन बिशराइ दीनी व ख़वातीमि अमली व क़ल्बी लिक़ल्बिकुम सल्म व अम्री लिअम्रिकुम मुत्तबि, सलवातुल्लाहि अलैकुम व अला अरवाहिकुम व अला अज्सादिकुम व अला अज्सामिकुम व अला शाहिदिकुम व अला गाइबिकुम व अला ज़ाहिरिकुम व अला बातिनिकुम السلام عليك يا ابن رسول الله، السلام عليك يا ابن نبي الله، السلام عليك يا ابن أمير المؤمنين، السلام عليك يا ابن الحسين الشهيد، السلام عليك أيها الشهيد، السلام عليك أيها المظلوم وابن المظلوم. لعن الله أمة قتلتك، ولعن الله أمة ظلمتك، ولعن الله أمة سمعت بذلك فرضيت. السلام عليك يا أولياء الله وأحباءه، السلام عليكم يا أصفياء الله وأوداءه، السلام عليكم يا أنصار دين الله، السلام عليكم يا أنصار رسول الله، السلام عليكم يا أنصار أمير المؤمنين، السلام عليكم يا أنصار فاطمة الزهراء سيدة نساء العالمين، السلام عليكم يا أنصار أبي محمد الحسن بن علي الولي الزكي الناصي، السلام عليكم يا أنصار أبي عبد الله بأبي أنتم وأمي طبتم وطابت الأرض التي فيها دفنتم وفزتم فوزا عظيما، فيا ليتني كنت معكم فأفوز معكم. السلام عليك يا أبا الفضل العباس بن أمير المؤمنين، السلام عليك يا ابن السيد الوسيين، السلام عليك يا ابن أول القوم إسلاما وأقدمهم إيمانا وأقومهم بدين الله وحوتهم على الإسلام. أشهد لقد نصحت لله ولرسوله ولأخيك فنعم الأخ المواصي. فلعن الله أمة قتلتك، ولعن الله أمة ظلمتك، ولعن الله أمة استحلت منك المحارم وانتهكت حرمة الإسلام. فنعم الصابر والمجاهد المحامي الناصر والأخ الدافع وأخي المجيب إلى طاعة ربي الراغب فيما زيد فيه غير من الثواب الجزيل والثناء الجميل. وألحقك الله بدرجة آبائك في جنات النعيم. اللهم إني ترست لزيارة أوليائك رغبة في ثوابك ورجاء لمغفرتك وجزيل إحسانك، فأسألك أن تصلي على محمد وآل الطاهرين، وأن تجعل رزقي بهم دار وعيش بهم خار وزيارة بهم مقبولة وحياة بهم طيبة، وأدرجني إدراج المكرمين، واجعلني ممن ينقلب من زيارة مشاهد أحبائك مفلحا منجيا قد استوجب غفرانك الذنوب وستر العيوب وكشف الكروب، إنك أهل التقوى وأهل المغفرة. السلام عليكم يا أئمة المسلمين علي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى محمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن بن علي. السلام عليك يا حجة الله يا ابن الحسن يا صاحب الزمان. السلام عليك يا حجة الله يا ابن الحسن يا صاحب الزمان. أجل الله لك ما وعدك من الناس وظهور الأمر ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم كن لوليك الحجة ابن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا، حتى تسكنه أرضك توعا وتمتعه فيها طويلا. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.